Okay, good evening, everybody. And I hope everyone has a copy of the handout. Obviously, a semester studying about the Maral, at some point, we would have to talk about the Golem. It only makes sense that we would get there. But my hope for this evening is that a lot of the work that we have already done in trying to best understand who the Maral was and who the Maral was not might give us a little bit of context for all of the, for all of the study about this discussion. So anybody could read about the Golem and decide whether they think it's real or not, but to understand the questions that are asked about the Golem story, you have to know a lot about the Maral. And I think many of the themes that we talked about in the first 5 sessions or so will work their way back tonight, and hopefully they will add a little bit of color to what is a very unusual piece of Jewish history. So the pages are not numbered, but I guess what theoretically would be page 2. 3 Golem stories, Rubber of Zirkind and Prague. Let's start with Prague because we're here to talk about the Maral, and then we will go from there. Okay, this is the story that was originally published in 1847, which is 239 years after the Maral passes away. Okay, during the reign of Rudolf II, there lived among the Jews of Prague a man named Bezalel, who, because of his tall stature and great learning, was called the Great Rabbi. This rabbi was well versed in all of the arts and sciences, especially in the Kabbalah. By means of this art, he could bring to life figures formed out of clay or carved from wood, who, like real men, would perform whatever task was asked of them. Such homemade servants are very valuable. They do not eat, they do not drink, and they do not require any wages. They work untiringly. One can scold them, and they do not answer back. Okay? The context in which these stories are told, or the details about the Golem that you read about in each version of the Golem story, are very different, and the details kind of tell you what was most impressive. So if you are like me and you're reading the Golem story, you have your own preconceived notion about what the purpose of the Golem was. So anybody want to volunteer? Yeah, why do you build a Golem? Okay, so you're a very vulnerable Jew. You live in the rising anti-Semitism on campus, and if every campus had a Golem there, we'd be better off, right? This version of the story, the 1847 version of the story, is not concerned with anti-Semitism. What's it concerned with? Right, servitude, free work, right? By the way, how do these servants know how to do anything? Right? They don't have any cultural context. You think you can take them out with you to the bar and they'll protect you if you get into a fight? That doesn't seem likely, does it? But for this context, they seem to follow instructions. They're disciplined. You know, servants are very expensive and they eventually get annoyed and they talk back to you. So the Golem follows all the instructions. You don't have to pay him anything. He doesn't need anything. And he never talks back. So he's the ideal servant. So the Maral, Rabbi Lo, had fashioned for himself one such servant out of clay. You know what I forgot to do? I forgot to mention, I apologize, that the Sondheims were dedicating our shir tonight in memory of David's aunt, whose yahrzeit is observed tonight, Rivka Bas Uri. So better late than never. Thank you for the sponsorship and the Neshama Shev and Aliyah. Okay. So Rabbi Lo had fashioned for himself one such servant out of clay, placed in his mouth the name. Okay, what's the name? Okay, what name? So someone said Shin Daled Yud. Someone else said, okay, so something. Okay, who knows? So he placed the name, magic formula, it's translated as here. If you want to know what Hashem is, magic formula, and thereby brought him to life. This artificial servant performed all the menial tasks in the house throughout the week, chopping wood, carrying water, etc. On the Sabbath, however, he was required to rest. Are golems allowed to work on Shabbos? I'm asking you seriously. I kind of seriously. What? Can you use Alexa on Shabbos? Alexa is the golem of the 21st century. How about animals? Are your animals allowed to work on Shabbos? No, right? That's not a trivia question. That's biblical verses, right? Everything in the, we don't think about that. Well, who cares what the cows do on Shabbos? Let them plow. That's not how it works, right? Everybody rests on Shabbos. Everything you own is supposed to rest on Shabbos, okay? So he has to rest on Shabbos too. Does that mean he's a human being? Not necessarily. Avadim are human beings. Careful. Avadim are human beings too. Even the Bible believes that. But whatever he is, I'm saying it doesn't mean that he's a human being. It doesn't mean he's a Shomer Shabbos. It just means that he's living. What? Who said he doesn't have an neshama? You assume that. It's interesting. We'll get back to that. Okay. Who said that? So are you. We're also Afar Min Adama. So how do you know? Let's not assume too much. But so far, all I'm saying is that he has to keep Shabbos, right? We'll get back to it in a little bit, but it doesn't mean what you think it means, okay? It doesn't mean... Excellent. Okay, very good. I like that observation. That's a fun observation. Does it mean that he has to keep Shabbos or you are not allowed to put him to work on Shabbos? So for example, if your animals are doing things on Shabbos, you don't have to interfere with what they're doing if they have to be doing malacha. If your children are doing malacha on Shabbos, you have to get in the way. So where does the golem fit in? So only the Avadim absolutely have to observe Shabbos. They are people. They're Shomer Shabbos. They're absolutely Shomer Shabbos, Avadim. Okay? So the only point I'm making one step at a time, the point that I'm making is very simple, which is that the fact that he has to keep Shabbos doesn't mean too much, but it might be a touch point for a bigger conversation about who this golem is, okay? So on the Shabbos, however, he was required to rest. Therefore, before the day of rest had begun, his master removed from his mouth the name and made him dead. Because if he's going to be alive on Shabbos, he's going to be working. So you have to turn Alexa off before you light candles, right? Something like that. Once, however, sometimes rabbis are busy on Erev Shabbos. So first you build the golem, you say, it's no big deal. It takes a couple of minutes to shut it down before Shabbos. It's worth it. But then people start calling with Kosher questions and forgot to print the bulletin. And all of a sudden the rabbi runs out of time. So he forgot to turn off his golem. Once, however, the rabbi forgot to do this and calamity ensued. Now, if you're reading this like a halachist for a second, which is very difficult to do when you're reading a story about the golem, why does calamity ensue when the Maral is not keeping Shabbos properly? Is it like a coincidence? No, or there's something metaphysical happening here, right? Meaning when the Maral doesn't keep Shabbos, it's different than you not keeping Shabbos. It is a calamity, not because calamities followed, but because the very fact that the Maral's Eved is running loose on Shabbos is itself a calamity. Okay, if that makes sense. The magical servant became enraged. Right? I thought we hired this guy because there's no emotions. He doesn't get mad about it. Whatever you ask him to do, he does. But now he's on Shabbos and he's furious. He's enraged, tore down the houses, threw rocks all around, pulled up trees, and carried on horribly in the streets. People hurried to the rabbi to tell him the situation, but the difficulty was great. Right? It's a real shiloh what to do now when you have a golem running around on Shabbos, because the Sabbath was already at hand and all labor, whether to create or to destroy, was strictly forbidden. The amount of people that have read the Golem story and aren't holding in Hilchos Shabbos, they don't appreciate the godless of this story. So Shabbos starts and they say to the Maral, you got to turn off the Golem because he's wreaking havoc all over the neighborhood. But it's a big shiloh. What happens when you pull the Shem HaMeforash out from the Golem? What happens to him? He what? He dies. Are you allowed to kill things on Shabbos? No, you're not allowed to. You're not allowed to create. You're not allowed to destroy. Strictly forbidden. How then to undo the magic? What are you going to do? The rabbi's dilemma with his golem was like that of the sorcerer's apprentice and his broom in Goth's poem. Fortunately, the Sabbath had not yet been consecrated in the Altena Shul. And see that, right? That's the main central synagogue of Prague. And since this is the oldest and most honorable synagogue in Prague, everything is set according to it. Now, again, I don't know who wrote this originally and where they got all their lumdus from, but everybody knows this is a whole big shiloh. When does Shabbos start? Whenever we accept Shabbos, assuming you accept Shabbos early. So are people allowed to accept Shabbos at different times? How many husbands accept Shabbos when they get to shul and they say Mizmor Shir Liyom Shabbos, and their wives haven't accepted Shabbos yet because they're still got 18 minutes to go? So he accepts it at this time and she accepts it at that time. But when does it really start? So it really should start either when Shkia hits and it's too late, or when the town decides Shabbos begins. So how is that determined? The Gabbai of the main synagogue of the community decides when Shabbos begins, and that's called Minhag HaMakom. We don't have Minhag HaMakom anymore, but they had Minhag HaMakom in Prague. So everybody's keeping Shabbos. They got their Shabbos clothes on, they're going to shul, they're davening. But in the Altena shul, which is the central synagogue of Prague, Shabbos hasn't started. So did Shabbos start or did Shabbos not start? I guess B'diavad Shabbos hasn't started because it hasn't started communally. And since it's the oldest and most honorable synagogue in Prague, don't forget this. This halachically will be fascinating by the end of this year. Everything is set according to it. There was still time to remove the name from this crazy youth. The master hurried, tore the magic formula from the mouth of the golem, and the lump of clay dropped down and fell in a heap because Shabbos hadn't started. He was allowed to kill it. Alarmed by this event, the rabbi didn't wish to make such a dangerous servant again. Even today, pieces of the golem are to be seen in the attic of the Altena synagogue. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, this is the Prague version, one of the Prague versions of the story of the Maharal's Golem. Now, Tommy Sandel will tell you, if I'm not mistaken, we're going to get back to it a little bit later. What's the minhag in the Altena shul in Prague? Tommy? In Altena shul in Prague, on Friday night, when they finish Kabbalah Shabbos, you say Mizmor Shir and Liyom Shabbos and Hashem Malach. In the Altena shul in Prague, they say Mizmor Shir Liyom Shabbos twice. And if you visit there with a tour guide that likes to make tips on telling Maral stories, they'll tell you, why do you say Mizmor Shir Liyom Shabbos twice in the Altena shul in Prague? Because they're about to start Shabbos and then they had to stop because the Maral had to turn off the golem. So he turned off the golem and then they said Mizmor Shir again because it was such a close call. So they said it twice. And to this day, which is true, that in the Altena shul in Prague, they say Mizmor Shir Liyom Shabbos twice on Friday night. And they assume, or they tell people, that it has something to do with that fateful Friday night when it was a close call and the Maral barely had enough time to turn off his golem. Hold on to that, because that is one of the most famous stories about the Maral. And a few people, Jeff Lautman, who's on here from somewhere in the Midwest, and Tommy mentioned it to me and others, and we're going to get back to it. There's another story about a golem. You can see it on the left on that page number 2. This is a story that is not found in a Jewish source, but in a Christian source, a letter from a Christian writer whose name was Christoph Arnold in the 1674. After saying certain prayers, and he's writing to a friend about the creation of a golem in a Jewish community. After saying certain prayers and holding certain fasts, they make the figure of a man from clay. Now, just keep that in mind. It's also important. I don't think it was in the first version, unless I forgot. You have to be mitaher yourself if you're going to get involved in the process of creation. You can't just like show up from work, grab a quick bite, make a golem. You got to go to mikvah, you got to say tehillim, you got to do it the right way. Think about that contextually, like who would conceptualize the process of building a golem as requiring a preparatory tahara process, okay? After saying certain prayers, holding certain fast days, they make the figure of a man from clay. And when they've said the Shem HaMeforash, the explicit and unmentionable name of God over it, the image comes to life. And although the image itself cannot speak, note in the Prague version of the Maral story, what happens? Can he speak? Did we say that? We said he's not chutzpah, right? You ask him to do stuff, he doesn't talk back to you. It's not the same as saying he doesn't have the koach hadibor. He can't speak. What is said to itself cannot speak. It understands what's said to it and commanded. Among the Polish Jews, it does all kinds of housework, but is not allowed to leave the house. This is not a story about Prague, Christoph Arnold. This is about a story about Jews in Poland that have a golem. On the forehead of the image, They write emet, that is truth. But a figure of this kind grows each day. Though very small at first, it ends by becoming larger than all those in the house. In order to take away its strength, it ultimately becomes a threat to all those in the house, meaning the golem grows uncontrollably. So you craft it and it's a certain size, but it grows and grows and grows and grows. So there's only a matter of time before it must be destroyed. In the Prague version of the story, I didn't intend to be medaic so much in these random sources, but in the Prague version of the story, what happened? How long do you have your golem for? You have him till Shabbos, then you got to shut him down. In this version of the story, he grows and grows and grows and grows, and eventually it becomes a problem. So you have to start with the new, smaller version before it grows out of control. They quickly erase the first letter Aleph from the word emes on his forehead, so that there remains only the word mace, that is dead. When this is done, the golem collapses and dissolves into the clay or the mud that he was. They say that a Baal Shem, literally a master of the name, like Baal Shem Tov, right? Baal Shem. In Poland, there was such a person by the name of Rebbe Elias, otherwise known as Eliyahu of Chelm. There was such a person, made a golem who became so large that the rabbi could no longer reach his forehead to erase the letter E, the letter Aleph, right? Sounds familiar. The Maral makes a golem and everything's perfect, but the one Erev Shabbos and then it's a disaster. So Eliyahu of Chelm, who this story is told about, made a golem and everything's fine as long as you shut him down before he gets too large. But unfortunately, he missed the window and then he couldn't scratch the Aleph off the top of the forehead because he got there too late. So he thought up a trick, namely that the golem, being his servant, should remove his boots because they always listen to instructions. So he says, bend down and take off my boots, supposing that when the golem bent over, he would erase the letters. And so it happened. But when the golem became mud again, his whole weight fell on the rabbi who was sitting on the bench and crushed him. In this version of the story, every detail matters. Don't dismiss them until the shiur is over. In this version of the story from Christoph Arnold, which is supposedly a historic source, not just a fable, Eliyahu of Chelm, the creator of this golem in Poland, died when the golem crushed him. It's for those who know the legend of the Shagas Aryeh died when his Svarim shelf fell on him with all of his Svarim, which is, I think, just a legend. Sounds kind of similar. Okay, so we have these two versions of the story. How many people are still with me thinking by 9 o'clock we'll be making a golem before we go home? How many people think like this is for Halloween, not for Hanukkah? It's a strange story, right? So do Jews believe in golems or do Jews not believe in golems? What's the deal? You're in. You don't like Avadim, but golems you like. I'm just joking. Okay. There is one major Talmudic source that is relevant for the sugya of the golem. One Gemara. And this is the only Gemara you need, because if you have one Gemara, you're set, right? One Talmudic source about a golem that must be read before the shiur can continue. Okay, it's a fascinating Gemara in Sanhedrin on Daf Samach Hey Amid Beis. The Aramaic, the Gemara is in front of you on the bottom of page 2, and the English version of it is on the top of page 3. They just didn't make it onto the same page, so whichever is more convenient for you to follow along. The Gemara says as follows. I wanted to start with Rabbi Akiva. Okay, 3 lines before it gets wide towards the top of the source. Okay, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Akiva Magia Lemikra Zeh. When Rabbi Akiva got to the pasuk of, which we'll see in a second, he would cry. I'm sorry, the pasuk that preceded it. The Gemara says, a person can connect to the spirit. So Rabbi Akiva would cry about this pasuk. If somebody tries to contaminate themselves by engaging in tumah, so then ruach tumah, shora alav ruach tumah. You know, it's so sad, Rabbi Akiva says. It's so easy to corrupt yourself. You're an innocent person, and if you're not careful, you can immerse yourself fully in impurity. And if that's true, if you can impurify yourself, isn't it also true that we can be matahir ourselves? We should be able to. If not for our averos, we could be really holy people, but we contaminate ourselves. It's our fault, says Rabbi Akiva. It's your sins that separate you from God. If you were a pure person, your connection to God would be unfiltered. Now, what does that mean? What would happen if you were a purified person? If you didn't have any averos that held you back, how would you be different? You would be more godly. You would be connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What capacity would you have if you weren't separated by sin? What's a godly act? What does Hashem do? God creates things. So I would be more of a creator if I was as pure as God. Amar Rava, Iba'u tzadike baru alma. So Rava says, if the righteous wanted to, they could create worlds. Shenemar ki avonosechem hayu mavdilim. So Rava says the same thing as Rabbi Akiva. He just formulates it differently. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu was a creator and he imbues us with the potential to create, if not for our sins, we would be creating worlds of our own. In fact, the Gemara says about Rava himself, Rava bara gavra. Rava, who was not impacted by the sins that contaminate you or me, was so holy that he himself created a human being. Translated loosely, he created a gavra. What did he do? What happens? You're in the base measures, you create a person. What do you do with it? Anybody? You already read the first story. You put it to work to sweep the floors. What do you do with it? Oh, we'll get back to Minnie in a second. Don't put him. You show him off to your friends. Look what I made, right? Shadre lekame d'Reb Zera. So he made a golem. He created a person. So he sent that person to Rabbi Zera. Havakoi mishtoi bahade velo kamahadrele. So Rabbi Zera said, "May I help you, sir?" He doesn't say anything because golems don't talk. Not a perm spiel. Sanhedrin, Samachayim and Beis. I didn't make it up. He's not talking. So Rabbi Zera is face to face with a human being. Does he look like a human being? That's the impression you get. The only reason Rabbi Zera is suspicious is because he doesn't say anything. He doesn't respond. Hello, what's your name? What are you doing here? Nothing. All blanks. Amar le min chavrea. Oh, my friend must have sent you over. You're from my buddy. In other words, one of my fellow righteous men created you. You're a golem. It's obvious. Haha, Rava, very funny. Hadar la'afarech. And if that's the case, you should go back to being the dust from which you were created. In other words, it's just a prank of some sort. Who knows what this Gemara means? Rav Chanina v'Rav Oshia havu yasve kol mali Shabbasa. Rabbi Chanina and Rav Oshia would sit every Erev Shabbos v'aske b'sefer Yitzira. Rav Chanina and Rav Oshia would study the book of creation, Sefer Yetzirah, Kabbalistic work that either was around during their time or maybe originated even at the times of Avram Avinu. Who knows? Sefer Yetzirah, umivrile igla tilsa v'achlile. Igla tilsa is the Gemara's way of saying like prime rib, right? That's a Talmudic way of saying, but whatever exactly igla tilsa is, it's 3 months old. It's the third one from its mother. It's the finest cut of meat there is. So if you had Sefer Yetzirah and you didn't have Averos that interfered with your ability to craft and create and to control things in the world, what would you do? So you read the first story and you say to yourself, well, now I won't have to mop because I'll build somebody to mop for me. Or maybe you're worried about anti-Semitism, so you'll build somebody to protect you. Rava has no agenda. He just sends Reb Zera a golem. He says, look what I could do. Can you do it? And Reb Zera maybe destroys it, maybe not. Reb Chanina, Reb Oshia, why grocery shop when you can make meat of your own? Right? They don't need to go hunting animals. They just create animals for themselves. That's what they used to do every Erev Shabbos. It was routine. It was routine. So do we believe in golems? I mean, the Gemara is thumbs up. The Gemara absolutely seems to endorse this idea as historical fact. There's Sefer Yetzirah, and this is what Sefer Yetzirah does. Right? Rava says not everybody could do it. Got to go to mikvah. Got to say your tehillim. You can't have averos on your record. But theoretically speaking, there's something happening here. Is the bara gavra of this story the kind of golem story that we hear about the Maharal, Prague, and Rav Elia, Chelm? Maybe yes, maybe no, because the terminology is not exactly the same, but it is pretty close. For a Beferish Gemara, it's pretty amazing. Aryeh Kaplan, who wrote a lot about Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah, I really don't know very much about Rabbi Kaplan. I have to tell you, maybe I'm not old enough. And one day I'll get there and I'll read more Aryeh Kaplan. But he has many, many books, most of which I admit I have not read. But one of the things that Rabbi Kaplan did accomplish in his lifetime, in his short lifetime, was a translation of Sefer Yetzirah, which you can read on Google Books, because Mashiach must be coming. Sefer Yetzirah is available with Google Translate. So that's pretty amazing. If you look in Aryeh Kaplan's Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation in theory and practice, I just gave you 2 columns from one of the pages where he talks about the creation of golems in the Sefer Yetzirah. And figure 37 is instructions on how to make a golem from the Rokeach. The Rokeach is not some random source. The Rokeach is a prominent member of Hasidei Ashkenaz in the 13th century. Rabbi Eliezer Rokeach has Shuvos and commentaries on the Gemara, is a serious person, a very serious early Ashkenazic source. And the box on top of you says, Osek b'Sefer Yetzirah, Yesh lo latar atzmo lilbosh begadim levanim, ve'en lo ladam lasot yechidi. He gives you the exact instructions. So you got to be mitar yourself. You have to put on clean clothes. You shouldn't do it alone because it's a very dangerous process, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the bottom, he starts to give you can see it 3 lines from the end of the box, 4 lines from the end of the box. You see the olives with the different nakudos? So you have to do Da Vinci Code in order to create the golem. Aleph with a pataf, aleph with a chirik, aleph with a segel, and then you do the base. Exact instructions on how to build a golem. And Rabbi, yes, it absolutely is, because it's about the potential to create things Kabbalistically. The method of creating a golem is outlined by Rabbi Eliezer Rokeach in his commentary to the Sefer Yetzirah. In addition to everything else that the Rokeach wrote, he also wrote a commentary on this very brief and mysterious Kabbalistic work and presented somewhat greater detail by the author Emek HaMelech, which is in figure 30, oh, it's a different one. Oh, I know, figure 38, that's from Emek HaMelech, same thing, you can't really read it. Im Tirza Livro Golem, you could see it in those first few words in the tiny, tiny print. I'm happy to send larger copies if you're not able to zoom in on it on the hard ones. An initiate should not do it alone, but should always be accompanied by 1 or 2 colleagues. The golem must be made of virgin soil, taken from a place where no man has ever dug. The soil must be kneaded with pure spring water and taken directly from the ground. If this water is placed in any kind of vessel, it can no longer be used. The people making the golem must purify themselves totally before engaging in the activity, both physically and spiritually. While making the golem, they must wear clean, white vestments. These authors also stress that one must not make any mistake or error in the pronunciation. They do not say what must be done if one errs, but from other sources, it would appear that at the very least, one would have to begin the array from the beginning. During this entire procedure, no interruption whatsoever may occur. You can't have a hefsek. Yeah. The Rokeach, about 300 years earlier. 300 years earlier. I think there's a story, but I don't remember if this is exactly true. I saw it quoted. I did not see the source itself. I believe that the Rokeach, in addition to writing this commentary, is reported to have created a golem of his own. But the golem that was created by the Rokeach was a female. And I believe the story, again, I should have found the source. I just didn't find it in time. I believe the way the story is recorded is that the Rokeach had some kind of illness that made him contagious, and he was living in isolation, and he didn't have anybody to help him out. So he created a maid to take care of his needs around the house. But the story is reported that it became kind of a joke that this rabbi created a woman because he was all alone and decided that it probably wasn't good for his reputation and got rid of it. Something like that. That's the way the story is recorded. I didn't find an original source for it, but the Rokeach absolutely wrote a commentary on the Sefer Yetzirah. That's a fact. And in it, he gives very specific instructions, not only on the potential to create, but how it should be created and what should be said so that the golem could be made. So on the one hand, we're kind of reverse engineering this story because we're working off the assumption that there's this great legend about the Maral, that the Maral made a golem. We see that there are other versions of the story that are almost identical, Jewish sources, non-Jewish sources, that tell the same kind of story about a rabbi in Poland pretty much during the same era. And if we're totally skeptical about it, we have to go back even further in Jewish history to see that the Talmud endorses the notion of a golem, or the creation of some kind of being on the part of the Chachamim. It's found in the Sefer Yetzirah. It is endorsed, perhaps practiced, illuminated by the Rokeach himself and other Kabbalistic works as well. It's not as if the concept of a golem at large just appeared because there was once a guy in Prague who was a Kabbalist and he created human beings. It's a much more ancient story in Jewish history. What it means and how much we believe in it, that's, of course, a complicated question. But this story predates the Maral very much so, not only from the times of the Rishonim, but even back to the times of the Gemara. Rava's Golem? I think so. Unless you assume that the Sefer Yetzirah was an earlier source than the times of the Amoraim. So maybe the instructions to build a golem predated Rava, theoretically, but I don't know about the creation of a specific one. Yeah. So there's two purpose questions. One purpose question is, why would someone create a golem? But we already have a laundry list of possibilities. There's a lot of incentive, from the best of incentives to the worst of incentives, or the most genuine to the least, or however you want to say it. The second question would be, why, if we believe in this, what does it mean that our potential to create in the world gives us the potential to create golems? You know, Hashem creates, so we create. What does that mean? Well, it means maybe we parent children if we're lucky enough to have kids. Or maybe it means that Hashem creates things yesh me'ayin, but we create a better environment. God creates the garden, and it's our job to root out all the weeds and to grow and plant new things. When you engage in the ethical question of kilayim, why does the Torah tell us that we can't breed new things? So is there a limit to how much creation we should engage with? We shouldn't make new species. Hashem decided how many species there should be, and we live with the ones that he created with the capital C. What does it mean, philosophically and certainly mystically, that there is, if not, like Rabbi Akiva would cry, we would be so much better at life if we didn't have so many averos. The averos that we commit weigh us down. So we're physical beings. We can't do those things. We should be able to. If we were holier, if you were like Rava, you could accomplish so much more in life. But now you're playing on a whole nother level because of all the averos that you have in your back pocket that are holding you back. So what does it mean? It's kind of a fascinating question. Are we imbued with the potential to create? Or do we not believe that this is within the realm of possibility? Okay. Many of you remember that there was a famous dispute between Rav Yaakov Emden and Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz. If you don't know the story well, I happen to not know enough of the story. Maybe we'll do it another year in great detail. The basic premise of the story is that Yonasan Eibeshitz was suspected to be a follower of Shabtai Tzvi. Okay, so this is obviously this is later in Jewish history than the story of the Maharal, right? Yonasan Eibeshitz was suspected to be a Sabbatian after the death of Shabtai Tzvi. And one of the people who was very opposed, they saw themselves on a mission to uproot Sabbatianism from the Jewish community. One of the most vocal opponents to Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz's potential as a Sabbatian, which is, I think, still subject to the debate to this day, if in fact Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz was or was not a Sabbatian, was Rav Yaakov Emden, right? So that's a whole dissertation unto itself. That's Rabbi J.J. Schachter's dissertation, is Yaakov Emden, Yonasan Eibeshitz, lifelong debate. The reason that Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz was suspected to be a Sabbatian was why? Right, amulets is the beginnings of the suspicion, right? That Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz engaged in all kinds of Kabbalah, and if you lived at that time, in that moment, and you saw the amulets that he held and the things that he did, So then you assumed he was probably following Shabtai Tzvi. Now, the point I want to make, I'm really not qualified to make this point, but I'm going to make it anyway, is the following. If you're an amateur historian like myself, and you're thinking about this story, your assumption is Yonatan Eibeshitz is some kind of Kabbalist, and he walks around with amulets and red strings around his wrist, and he's all mystical and stuff. And what is Rabbi Yaakov Emden in this dialectic? He's like a Litva, right? He's like the most anti-Kabbalah halachic man, Joseph Soloveitchik, just a few centuries earlier. Is that the case? Was Rabbi Yaakov Emden a Kabbalist or a mystic? Or not at all? You know, Rav Chaim, certainly something different than the Litvak of today. He wasn't a Lakewood Kologa, right? Rav Chaim Volozhiner rips on the Hasidim that they're terrible and they have all of their priorities wrong because they spend all this time studying Kabbalah when they really should be learning Mishnayos and Shulchan Aruch. And if you read the rest of Nefesh HaChaim, you see that he was also engaged in deep philosophical, mystical, Kabbalistic questions of his time. It's not as clear of a breakdown as one would think it is, black and white in Jewish history. There's people who are into Kabbalah and there are people who are not. That's not the case. There was Sabbatian Kabbalah, which was very concerning. And then there was all the other Kabbalah that everybody else was doing, which nobody had any problem with. The reason I give you that background is because there is an unbelievable tshuva in the responsa of Rav Yaakov Emden, in which he debates a halachic question about something he had a discussion with his father. The father of Rav Yaakov Emden was Tzvi Ashkenazi, otherwise known as the Chacham Tzvi. There are a number of times in which, in the Sheilas Yavitz, which are the tshuvos of Rav Yaakov Emden, that he quotes from his father or dialogues that he had with his father. You know, when your father's a massive, generationally great talent, so many of the things that will come up in your tshuvos are, when I was in 4th grade, my father told me this amazing shot at the Shabbos table. If you're a smart kid, what's that? Yeah, Doni Avi Arash, right, exactly. So you have a few characters in Jewish history that are outstanding Talmidei Chachamim, whose fathers were also outstanding Talmidei Chachamim, and then as a result, they have this unique relationship. So Yaakov Emden has a number of responses in which he just says, by the way, my dad says the best thing. Or my favorite, my Rebbe in Yeshiva told me X, and when I brought it home to my father, he said that's baloney, right? Which is also great. So here's this tshuva from Rav Yaakov Emden. This is probably at some time in the middle of the 1700s. It's the bottom of this page beneath the Sefer Yetzirah. You can see Rav Yaakov Emden's bio there. If you look in my dad's Sefer, Chacham Tzvi, Siman Sadi Gimel, my father has the following question. My dad had this question always bothered him. I think the answer is really obvious, so I'm going to write about it. B'notzar al yidei Sefer Yetzirah in mitzaref la'asara. Who before asked a question about a minion? Somebody said something about using him for a minion. Who was that? Sid. So you obviously read the tshuva of Yaakov Emden before. My father, Chacham Tzvi, was wondering, if you make a golem, does he count to the minion? This would solve the minion problem when Shkia is early in the winter. You just stock the minion full of golems, and then you're good to go. So kashali, my kami boile. This is the language of this is such a classic responsa, but it sounds to us in the 21st century so ridiculous. My father asked the kasha as a golem mitzareh for the minion. My kashali, my kami boile. I don't even understand what the shaila is. Atu mi adiv micherashot of a katan de'ina mitzarefim. This is really fascinating. Rav Yaakov Emden says cherashot of a katan. Right? You have a child, or you have a shota who's mentally ill to the point that they're not responsible enough to know what's going on around them in the world, or you have a cheresh, which halachically would be a deaf mute that is uneducatable and therefore doesn't really understand what's going along around them either. So what's halacha? Chereshot of a katan, you can't count them to a minion. So the golem is a chereshot of a katan. Is that true? The golem doesn't talk back. But the golem smart. You give him tasks. You entrust him with taking care of the whole household. Even though Chereshot of a Katan have Kedushas Yisrael, right? Just because a Cheresh is unfortunately mentally ill and therefore isn't mitzaref for minion, doesn't mean they don't have the sanctity of a Jew. He's a Jew. These are people, human beings, imbued with the Kedusha, B'Tselem Elokim,
L'chol davar chutz min mitzvos, ve'hargon chayiv, which is a graphic way of saying they're humans. You can't kill a katan just because he's not chayiv in mitzvos, right? You can't kill a cheresh just because he didn't pass an IQ test, right? They're obviously human beings. They're full-fledged human beings. Are they mitzaref l'minyan? They're not mitzaref l'minyan, of course not. Ve'eslu daita kalishta mia v'kol shekain a katan da'asi l'chlal das v'afilu achi lo mitzaref. A katan he's not a bar das yet. In 6 months he's going to be bar mitzvah. He's going to count to the minyan. And do we count them? No. So you tell me a 12-year-old boy who is 6 months away from being bar mitzvah, you're not going to be mitzvah for the minyan. But a golem that has no intelligence and no independence and can't talk, you're going to be mitzvah for the minyan. Hi Gavra, Delav Bardeahu. This is the bold section. This person has no das. Who klal tzricha l'neimar mias b'klal chereshu. Do we even have to tell you that it's so obvious? He's not mitzvah for the minyan. Remember the story? The Gemara says that the Rava sent a Golem to Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera tried to talk to him. He couldn't say anything. So a cheresh, maybe within the cheresh somewhere there's intelligence and capacity. It doesn't exist here. He can't do anything. Can't say anything. Now again, I don't understand how Rabbi Yaakov Emden understands their ability to take care of the house. They're obviously intelligent. They follow instructions. So that's pretty good. Well, one second. Maybe. Havade garbine elashiesh ledakte. He said, okay, I don't know. Maybe I have to get into the weeds of exactly what a golem is, and then maybe it's not so simple. So he says, well, 1 second. Because the golem deaf? No, he's only mute. When the Gemara says a cheresh is not chayiv in mitzvos, it means a cheresh she'ena shomea ve'eno medaber. He is a deaf mute. If someone is deaf but they speak, if someone speaks but they're deaf, they're chayiv in mitzvos 100%. Right? That's another sugya for another day. So obviously Rava gave the golem instructions, and he says you have to go 3 blocks down, and then you make a left, and you go to the 4th house, and you knock on the door. And that's what he did to get to Reb Zera. So he's obviously disciplined. So then he's a cheresh, he's a mute, but he's not deaf. And if he's a mute, but he's not deaf, he's chayiv in mitzvos. If he's chayiv in mitzvos, he's mitzvah for minyan. He says, I don't think that's right. You know, he's not, the golem's not disabled. So why shouldn't he be able to speak? Ella mavin beremisos v'kritzos haya kemoshe melandim es hakelav leilech b'shlichos laholech ulahavi mu'uma me'adam acher kain shalcho lezeh v'hala. So he says, I don't understand. It's kind of a silly thought process, but Rav Yaakov Emden says, I don't understand if you're going to create a person from scratch, right? So are they going to have high cholesterol, right? Is this person going to have kidney failure? We haven't even begun to ask these questions. Why can't he speak? He could do everything else. So on the one hand, he's kind of like a cheresh. On the other hand, he's not like a cheresh. So Yaakov Emden comes to the following rational conclusion. The only way to understand how the golem follows instructions but cannot speak for himself is that he's not really listening or following instructions either. He's like a pet, and he needs to be trained. And if you bark at him or discipline him or you wave him in the right direction, he kind of figures out what to do. But he's not a normal person, and everything is normal except he happens to be mute, because then he would just be like Mitzvah Flamingan. He'd be a regular Jew. Now, it's interesting because he kind of almost assumes that he has a soul. Who brought up the soul question before? Somebody, right? So Yonias, is he a Jew? Is he chayiv in mitzvos? Is he B'Tselem Elokim? So he's all working off this question of what is the symbolism, what is the significance of the fact that he's mute. And then he says there's another sefer in the underlined section. I don't know what sefer he's referring to here. She'in chiyuso ela kichiyos habehema. The life of the golem is like the life of an animal. Everybody kills their golem in all of our stories, right? Eventually the golem gets out of hand and you kill him. So you're not allowed to kill people. You can give birth to children and you're responsible for creating them. It doesn't give you the right to kill them. So why are you allowed to kill your golem? So he says, like an animal, you're raising animals, you're allowed to chef them. So he gives birth to it. He creates a golem, he's allowed to kill it. And Cain, Pshita de eno elak behema betzuras adam u'ke'igla tilsa de mivrile le Reb Chiya le Reb Elazar. So then he says something really great at the end, which is what is the connection between the two stories in the Gemara. In the first story, Rava creates a golem. And in the second story, the two Amoraim on Erev Shabbos, they create an animal, Reb Chanina and Roshia. So the point is, they're both doing the same thing, right? They're both creating behemoths through the Sefer Yetzirah. One of them creates an animal that looks human-like. The other one creates an animal that looks like a prime rib. But it's all the same thing. So Rav Yaakov Emden comes to this remarkable conclusion that the golem has the status of a behemoth, and therefore his father, the Chacham Tzvi, shouldn't have worried about this at all. Obviously, the golem is not mitzaref for minyan. It happens to be, which is really interesting, that the Chacham Tzvi and Rav Yaakov Emden, his son, come from a certain family of Polish Jews. And the great-great-great-great-grandfather, 150 years earlier, of Chacham Tzvi was, don't say Maral Prague, Eliyahu of Chelm, the man about whom the first Golem story is told, which is really interesting, and he references it in other places in his writings. It seems to be that the Chacham Tzvi's fascination with the creation of the Golem was because the stories that were told in his time about the Golem were the stories of Eliyahu of Chelm, who was his ancestor, by 150 years or so, something like that. Yeah. Okay.
The same exact question, and I don't remember who was the one who wrote the letter, but he says that one of the rabbis specifically said you can kill it, but there's a change whether or not you can. There must have been there's something positive about it. You can't just kill it outright. There has to be a dangerous thing. Therefore, once that should come in.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so you have to send it to me. We have to look at it, and maybe we can follow up about it next week. Look at the end of the tshuva. Agav Azkir kan masha shamati mi pekadosh. Avi Morinu Zal, right? I want to mention what I heard from my father. Mashakara ba'oso she notzar al yidei zikno hagon Rav Eliyahu Baal Shem Zal. I want to mention to you, he says here, something that I heard from my dad about the golem that was created by our ancestor, Rav Eliyahu of Chelm. Ki achar shera'uhu holech v'gadol me'od nisyare shelo yachriv ha'olam. Does this sound familiar, everybody? It's not just some random story that's found in the folklore of Prague. It's found in the Chuvos of Rav Yaakov Emden. He says, in that story, my father told me that the golem that was created by our ancestor was getting so big he was going to destroy the world. He says he removed the name that was engraved on the head, and that's how he killed it. That's how he got the golem to go back, to return to the dust of the earth. Avol hiziko v'asabo sarit b'fanav v'od shenis asek v'netikas Hashem imenu b'chosek. And what does that mean? The last line. In the process of destroying the golem, he got scratched along the face. So in one folklore version of this story, Eliyahu of Chelm gets crushed by the golem that he destroys. In Rav Yaakov Emden's version of the story, which is about his great Zaidi, he didn't get killed. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't be here in this generation, maybe. But he was his grandfather, great-grandfather, whoever it was permanently injured or scarred or marked because of the process of getting rid of this golem before it destroyed the world. So why do people think that the golem was created by the Maharal? Do we have any evidence whatsoever that the Maharal created a golem? Does the Maharal write in any of his many svarim where he writes about many fascinating topics? Does he write about creating a golem? Anyone been to the Alton Shul in Prague and paid extra money to go to the attic to look at the remnants of the golem? I'm sure they do tell you. What do you think is up there? Not very much, right? We haven't been. We're going to go as a group in the spring. We'll find a way to go on a trip. I think all of us should go to Prague together. And in the versions of the story about Rav Eliyahu of Chelm, they also say the remnants are still there. Right, or it's the first robot, artificial intelligence. By the way, all of the sugyas about artificial meat, you heard it here first. Did we read these articles about lab-grown beef? So is lab-grown beef kosher? Big Shiloh right now. I mean, every year it's at the Wall Street Journal. So it's been right now for like a decade. The price isn't going down or up, right? But it's expensive. Is it kosher? Are you allowed to eat meat that's grown in a test tube? I mean, why not if it's synthetic, right? Is it fleshig? Have we done the shear yet? I mean, I haven't done it. Has it been done? If it's not overdone, we'll do the sugya. It's a great sugya. Where are we going to look? Sanhedrin, Samachem and Beis, all the poskim quote this Gemara. There were once two rabbis on Erev Shabbos. The grocery store was closed, so they made an animal of their own. So what was it? They make a bracha? Was it kosher? Was it treif? Was it milchig? Was it fleshig? That's what the Gemara says. They created an animal. So you have to ask yourself all these questions. Was it kosher? Was it not? This is the sugya. Do we have any indication that the Maral did anything like this? I don't think there is. Yes, the lore is there, right? It's very thick and present, right? Among the Goyim too, right? And the Goyim, European history, which I will not be able to present, but European history from Frankenstein to the Golem obviously believes in these things and brought these stories to life. There's no question about it. This is just one of them. There's only one thing about the Maharal that is remotely curious that people quote that gives no indication whatsoever that the Maharal created a golem, but at least teases us with the possibility that maybe there was more to the Maharal than meets the eye when you read his Chidushei Agados. Okay, in this excellent article from Hillel Kaival, who is currently, I believe, a Jewish studies professor and historian at Wash U. I emailed him this morning just to say thank you for this incredible article that he wrote. So he quotes, just because it was in his article, so it's easily accessible. Everyone remember from a few weeks ago when we talked about David Gans, who was the Maharal's great student astronomer who worked with Tycho Brahe and all of the scientists of the day in Prague. So the reason that why were all of those astronomers in Prague in the end of the 16th century, because the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Rudolf II, moves his court to Prague and he funds all of these scientists. So if you weren't interested in Torah and science a few weeks ago, that's totally fine. But here's the story. Rudolf II brings all of these great people to Prague. And David Gans is a Talmud of the Maharal who gets to intern and do science experiments and study astronomy with all of these great people. And in his work of history, which he writes from the times of Moshe Rabbeinu all the way until 1592, he ends with everything that's being accomplished in the amazing times that they lived in 1592 in Prague. And he tells this story, the middle of this, the second paragraph in Hillel Kaival's article, which is just cut and paste. Our Lord the Emperor Rudolf, may his glory be exalted in full measure of his graciousness and correctness, sent for and called upon our master of Loba and Bitzalel to receive him with welcome and merry expression, and spoke to him face to face. In the Hebrew, it's peh el peh, which we've seen multiple times in the writing of the Maral as well, as one would to a friend. You know, most people can't get access to Rudolf II, but my Rebbe, the Maral Prague, was summoned into the chambers of Rudolf, and they spoke peh el peh. The nature and the quality of their words are mysterious, sealed and hidden, stumim, chasumim, v'ne'elamim. And this took place here in the Holy Community of Prague on Sunday, the 3rd of Adar, 1592. Everyone wonders what happened in the famous meeting between the Maral Prague and Rudolf II. And if you look on the wrong websites and the wrong places in the internet or the wrong articles, they'll say, well, it's obvious. If you were Rudolf II and you hired all the great astronomers of the day and you brought in all the great artists of the day, wouldn't you want to meet the guy who was creating the Golem? And 3/4 of the amazing stories, the Prague legends about the Maharal, which ultimately lead to the statue of the Maharal being designed and placed outside the courthouse in the center of town. Most of them are not about the Golem, but most of them do involve Rudolph II. Everybody wants to know why Rudolph II wanted a meeting with the Maharal Prague, and nobody knows. The closest we have to it is that David Gahn said they had a very interesting conversation. You could speculate what that conversation is, but you'll never know. Is it true that the only thing Rudolph was interested in is Kabbalah? Maybe. He might also have been interested in how some guy who's a Rosh Kollel is raising Talmidei Chachamim that are holding in Rashi and Tosfos and also doing science experiments with Tycho Brahe. That's also interesting, which would warrant a meeting. But then the legends become unbelievable. The stories say, oh yeah, Rudolph II wanted to expel all of the Jews from Prague, and there was no one who could get an audience with him to stop him. And the Maral realized that the only way to get to the palace was over the footbridge. So he stood at the footbridge, and all of the Goyim threw rocks at him, and the rocks turned into roses, and none of them hurt him. And Rudolph II summoned him to a meeting, was so impressed by the conversation that he retracted the expulsion of the Jews from Prague. There's no record that in the Maral's lifetime anybody was trying to expel the Jews. I assume it was not the greatest place to live, considering all the context of Jewish history. But in the Maral's time, in the Maral's place, you didn't need a golem to defend you from anti-Semitism. They didn't have pogroms in Prague in the 1570s, 80s, and 90s. They didn't. And Rudolph II, even the Maximilian, who was the emperor before him, hated the Jews much more than Rudolph did. Rudolph was a modern man. He was perfectly happy to have Jewish scientists and Jewish Kabbalists working in the town. That wasn't necessarily the case. I mentioned in the very first week, and I'm sorry, it's going to take us a little extra. I mentioned in the first week, we talked about the Yuchsin of the Maral. Remember, we talked about the Maral, the legends about his family and the accusations about the marriages and all of that stuff. And one of the primary sources for the Maharal was the Sefer of Meir Perels, who was hired to write the Yuchsin of the whole family. Does he make any mention in that story whatsoever? He talks about lots of interesting things about the Maral's family. Does he ever make any mention whatsoever at all of the Maral engaging in this kind of conduct? Nothing. If he created the Golem, it's a really interesting story. We'd love to hear more. It doesn't appear in any record whatsoever. So Kaivel makes the point in the bottom paragraph of this page, right across from the Golem's Latkes picture, which I just thought belonged in this handout. The rough coincidence of timing and geography has led Vladimir Sadek, who's an excellent Maral's study, to speculate that it was Polish Hasidim that generated the modern connection of the Golem legend to the Maharal and to Prague. He rightly observes that the Beshtian Hasidim and their pietistic predecessors venerated the Maharal and saw him as a spiritual precursor. Does this sound familiar from last week's shir? Maharal goes at, this is the reason all of this has to come together, right? Maharal disappears after he passes away. Outside of Prague, nobody's reading his Sfarim. They're not being republished. But 150 years later, when people start to study Kabbalah again with a newfound fervor, so Hasidic rabbis, leaders, dynasties in Poland start publishing all these great works from the Maharal. And in Poland in the 1800s, what kind of stories do they tell? Well, they tell stories about Eliyahu of Chelm and the Golem that he made. By the way, you know who else made a Golem? I heard the Maharal made a Golem. Makes sense. He's a very holy Jew. And all of a sudden they say, it seems, Zev Grias relates moreover that some of the same publishing houses that were responsible for the diffusion of Hasidic books in the late 18th and early 19th century also reissued the works of Judah. We saw this, right? No one in Prague was republishing. Maral was being republished by Hasidim in the 1830s and 40s. 1840s is when all the stories about the Golem were being told. So he suspects, Kushnitzer Rebbe, these are all the people we talked about. Yisrael ben Shabtai, enthusiastic publisher of works of halacha, admirers of the Maharal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So nobody knows for sure, but what all the historians assume is that in the 1800s in Poland, when Hasidim are studying Kabbalah in a modern way, right? They're studying Hasidus in their own way. They begin to tell stories about the people who came before them. What are they looking for? Modern day Hasidim. The very first Chassid who invented Chasidus says we've been Chassidish ever since Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Without acknowledging that there was a revolution. What are they looking for? They're looking for roots. They're looking to justify their practice of Judaism. And one of the people they turn to is Eliyahu of Chelm. The other one is, of course, the Maral. As we pointed out last week, it's not the greatest connection because the Maral was not a chassid by their definition. In fact, as we saw, if you look in the detail, many of the kinds of values that are taught by Hasidim were the antithesis of what the Maral was teaching. But the fact that he wrote so openly about Kabbalah, the fact that he challenged the notion of good and bad and physical and spiritual makes it curious if perhaps, maybe the Maral believed in these things. And as quickly as they start to tell stories like Rav Yaakov Emden heard from his father, Chacham Tzvi, who heard from previous generations that Eliyahu of Chelm in Poland was making a golem, I bet that guy made a golem too. He was very impressive. And they start to tell this story. I'm not saying it's for sure not true. It's always possible the Maral made a golem and he tricked us and none of us believe it. But it's certainly true that it wasn't until the 1840s that people start to associate this with him. Now, the Maral, if you Google search him or you search his text, does use the term golem, right? The term golem, referring to a human being who is lacking any kind of spirit or soul, is a term that is used. I wanted to look a little bit at the Netziv Atznius, but we're not going to get there in time. The Maral talks about this famous idea that Hashem creates us with different kinds of limbs and orifices, and Hashem gives us different sized fingers so we can cover our eyes so there are things we're not supposed to see, and we can fill our ears so that there's things we're not supposed to hear. And he talks about what it is to be a person who is a cheresh, to be a mute, and to be deaf. And I thought it was interesting that in that context, he uses the term golem, because the feature in the golem stories is, of course, a golem who is not deaf, but is mute, which is really interesting. So what does that make? The Maral talks about why someone who can't hear anything from anyone else is considered a disability. The inability to receive information from others was, in the Maral's philosophy, terribly crippling, more so than being unable to speak, which is really interesting. So we're not going to have time for it, but that's what he says. You can see in Schneier Lyman's article, which is also was above the Latka picture on the previous page, Chief Rabbi of Prague, noted scholar in Moscow, Solomon Judah Rappaport, once wrote, the Maral's hands did not produce a golem. His great wisdom is reflected not by the fact that he produced a golem, but rather by the fact that he produced its opposite. He produced a great disciple, the Gaon and Glory of Israel, Rav Yom Tov Liebman Heller, author of the Tosos Yontif, right? What's more impressive? To create a golem or to create the great commentary on Mishnah? That's what was said by the chief rabbi of Prague in the 1860s. More recently, Rav Moshe Eisenstatter wrote, was there a golem that walked the ghetto streets during the last quarter of the 16th century Prague? Did Maral indeed create a homunculus-like man to serve and protect the victimized Jewish populace? Let us but say that if asked, the question must be phrased, did Maral in fact create such a being? However, as to whether the master who so clearly saw the antecedents of the material world and the ideal spiritual one, how the former was determined and formulated by the latter, and who moved so freely and intimately from one level to another, whether he could have created a golem is no matter for debate at all. Okay, I don't know. So it's what to think about in terms of how skeptical you want to be. I want to show you one last thing before we end. This one, Tommy, this one's for you, the last page here. In Hillel Kaivel's article, he has wild speculation about the following problem. If you walk away from this year an hour and 15 minutes, whenever we finish, saying, oh yeah, there's this old legend about the Maral and it's a Baba myself. There's no evidence whatsoever that he created a golem. If anybody created a golem, it was a Polish thing. It certainly wasn't Czech, okay? There's one kasha, which is the question with which we started. In Prague, the attic may be empty, right? But in Prague, the minhag is to say Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbos twice on Friday night. What's pshat in the minhag? So Hillel Kaivel has this thing that he speculates. And I first thought he made it up. I went looking for it. He's not speculating at all. Okay? There is a sefer called Kape Aron, which is a collection of responsa by Rav Aaron Epstein, who was born in 1895, and he died in the Shoah. He was, I think, the last chief rabbi of Prague before the Holocaust, or up until into the Holocaust. He writes Kapei Aron, which is publishes it as Chelek Rishon, but there is no Chelek Sheni because he never finished it. He wrote a couple of other works as well, and he came to Prague. He was born in Ukraine, and he came to, I think he's from Munkat, right? That's where the Sefer was published. And he makes his way to Prague, where he becomes the chief rabbi at some point. And he functions as the chief rabbi in Prague until the Holocaust. In the Chuvos of Kapei Aron, Rav Aaron Epstein, who is the chief rabbi of Prague in the turn of the 20th century, asked the question, what's pshat with the minhag? He's Ukrainian, right? He didn't grow up with saying Mizmor Shir L'Yom Shabbos twice on a Friday night. So why did he say Mizmor Shir L'Yom Shabbos twice on Friday night in Prague? And he says something unbelievable, which is what Hillel Kaivel says in his article as well. The minhag in Prague for centuries, you could read the Hebrew on in your own, if your vision is good enough, in paragraph Aleph. The minhag in Prague on Friday afternoons was to do what? Not turn off the Golem, but turn off something else. What was the minhag in Prague? Anybody know? Friday afternoon, people have been to Prague. This is what they should tell on the tours because it's really interesting, halachically. What do they do in Prague on Friday afternoon? They do this thing. It's called Kabbalah Shabbat. What is Kabbalah Shabbos? You get together on Friday afternoon and you sing with your friends. Why do you sing with your friends on Friday afternoon? Because you're so excited Shabbos is coming, right? When does Shabbos start? In Prague, they start very early. Kabbalah Shabbos very early because they do lots of singing with musical instruments. Kabbalah Shabbos is not Shabbos. Shabbos starts with Mizmor Shir, L'Yom Shabbos. Shabbos starts with Pameh Malikin. Shabbos starts with Baruch Hu. L'chun and Ranana is let's sing some songs because Shabbos is going to start soon, right? In Prague, the long-standing practice was to perform Kabbalah Shabbos with musical instruments. What's the problem? Musical instruments are muktzah. If you have an expensive guitar, you can't just bring it to shul and stick it under your pew. What do you have to do with it? You got to pack up your stuff and unplug all of the cords, and you got to put everything away. The long-standing practice in Prague was that they said Kabbalah Shabbos very early in the afternoon because musical instruments were used in Kabbalah Shabbos. When Kabbalah Shabbos ended, everybody went home and they put on their Shabbos clothes and they put away their musical instruments and they came back to shul. So what did they do? They said Kabbalah Shabbos up until Mizmor Shir L'Yom Shabbos. This is a historical fact. And then the performance ended. They went home, they put their musical instruments away. They came back in Shabbos clothes and they started again, Mizmor Shir L'Yom Shabbos, and they started Shabbos. We do Kabbalah Shabbos. We assume halachically, what it says in Shulchan Aruch, that Shabbos begins with Mizmor Shir L'Yom Shabbos. So that's what they did. They said Mizmor Shir L'Yom Shabbos twice, once at the end of their Kabbalah Shabbos performance and once at the beginning of Maral. Now, Kaivel says, I don't think it's here in the Tshuva. Who got rid of this practice? I have to do a whole nother hour to figure out if this makes sense. Who is the next great chief rabbi of Prague? There are many. After the Maral, Noda B'Yehuda, V'Cheskel Landau, did not like musical instruments in shul. So they abolished the practice of musical Kabbalah Shabbat in Prague. However, the minhag of the shul remained. Mizmor Shir L'Yom Shabbos, followed by Kaddish, and then you say Mizmor Shir L'Yom Shabbos again before Shabbos starts. This is recorded in Shuvas Kapei Aron by the chief rabbi of Prague himself. I believe you can say that this is a historical fact. Kabbalah Shabbos was said for that reason. How remarkable it is that Prague has a very unusual practice of saying Mizmor Shir L'Yom Shabbos twice with a Kaddish in between. And most people's working assumption is the only explanation is that there was once a guy who created a golem and forgot to turn it off. And if not for the fact that they start Shabbos later in the Alkmaar Shul than they do in the rest of the town, he never would have been able to turn it off in time. And therefore, we continue to say Mizmor Shir L'Yom Shabbos twice. It's like, ode to the Golem. When in fact, there is a much more well-documented explanation for why that is the case. I'll just end by, yes. I would assume he knows it.
I'm sure he does.
Yeah.
But he talks about convening Shabbos early. And it was
Yes, yeah. And
Instead of waiting for Shabbos, I mean, I'm only saying it, instead of waiting for Shabbos again, get Shabbos early.
yes. So I wanted to mention the following, which is, yes, that's absolutely true. Remember in the story, I said kind of jokingly, like, it's such a lumdish story because Shabbos started here and didn't start there, but you should hold by the Altan Shul, etc. So in this tshuva, right at the end before Bays, he points out that the minhag in Prague has always been, wherever you daven in Prague, the rules always follow the people of the Altan Shul. And he gives an example that when there is no tachnun in the big shul, because there's a bris, I'm looking at the Gabayim with a straight face, right? If there's no tachnun in the Altan Shul, there's no tachnun in any of the shuls in Prague, because that determines the minhag. Right? I guess that we have to decide which shul in Riverdale determines when there's no tachnun, and we need one WhatsApp group for all of the Gabayim so they can all get along with each other. And he says that's what happened when we had my son and we made the bris. No tachnun in the whole town. So it's interesting that if you read these stories of the Golem like a secular, non-Jewish person in Prague in the 1900s, you're like, yeah, there's like magical powers and Frankenstein and all this stuff. If you read the stories, you realize that they were written by someone who understood the details, even though they're totally misconstrued and all jiggled together. But the fact that the standard practice in Prague is that everything follows what happens in the Altan Shul. And the fact is that in Prague, they have this weird practice that they say Mizmor Shel Yom HaShabbos twice, but none of it has anything to do with the Golem, I don't believe. But somehow the whole story of this great person in this great city in this multicultural environment and Rudolph II, there's a whole nother version of it, which has no factual historical evidence or basis whatsoever, but it's certainly a remarkable story. I made one mistake tonight, which was I did not give you a great picture of the statue of the Maharal in Prague. Okay, everyone can Google it after. I'll send it around to the email group so you can look at the different versions of it. Anybody know what you see in that picture? Yeah. Okay, you see the Maral, very tall. Don't know if that's what he looked like. You see a girl who is basically naked up against him. And what do you see beneath on the other side? A dog. So the problem is all of the descriptions of the statue, which was built in the early 20th century, are all in Czech. So I don't know what any of them mean. We'll have to find somebody who could translate it for us, right? I believe she's also holding a rose. All of the stories of the Maharal in Czech lore have something to do with the roses. Remember I mentioned before that he stops Rudolph on the bridge and all of the Goyim are throwing rocks at him and the rocks turn to roses. So the Malach HaMaves is always trying to get to the Maharal in Prague, but he can't kill him. He's like David HaMelech. He can't be taken by the Malach HaMaves. So the story is that a girl, maybe granddaughter, somebody brought him a rose and the Malach HaMaves hid within the rose. And when he accepted the rose from the granddaughter or whoever this girl is, that's when he died. And the dog in the picture is supposed to symbolize the downtroddenness of Jews as a product of their anti-Semitism. So the Maral that people remember, the Maral that is pictured, is this mystical, powerful, supernatural being who is a product of all of this incredible folklore. And I guess you'll never know what golems are and what Rav von Rav Zera thought. We're never going to really know. But what we can be pretty sure is that for all the creative explanations for what we hear about the Maral, there's also a very well-documented record of evidence that says the opposite. That these minhagim just reflect a very interesting person who lived in a very multicultural place, who lived a very beautiful life, and as far as we know, never made a golem at all. What to make of it? I'll leave that up to you, and we'll stop here.